This is the Central European Affairs podcast. My name is Zoltán, Kész, and I'm hosting this program today. Our guest is Ádám Bartha. Adam works for the Institute of Economic Affairs, an influential London think tank. He is the director of Epicenter, with the responsibility to enable the cooperation of the network and organize the private and public events program in Brussels. Adam, last time we met was a little more than a year ago in Istanbul, and a lot of things have changed. I remember the last time we talked about the Brexit situation was actually more than a year ago. And if I'm not mistaken, in your think tank, you were in minority regarding the issue of Brexit. How do you see it now?
It's a difficult question because it sounds pretty bad that I haven't changed my mind, but I haven't changed my mind. I think I'm still right. I think it's a loss both for the United Kingdom, and I think it's a special loss for the EU to have Brexit. I'm again pessimistic on the short-term stuff because I think the UK will see some increased pain as a result of Brexit. Trade between the UK and the EU has dropped massively in the last couple of months. Partially that's because of the pandemic, of course, but partially that's because of the new rules that came into force. I also have a personal anecdote, to be fair, because I have goods stuck at the border for the past 4 weeks. I'm supposed to pay £100 of taxes on goods that cost less than £200. So it's almost a 50% tax. For whatever reason, no one has been able to explain to me what that is for, why I'm supposed to pay taxes on goods that are coming from the European single market into Britain. We were told when there was a deal that there will not be customs and duties on the vast majority of products. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. I think earlier this week there were some discussions about how Amsterdam has taken over from London when it comes to the top sharing hub. So I think there will be some pretty obvious painful results of Brexit. But the long-term consequence really depends on domestic policies in Westminster. I'm more hopeful on that front without trying to be naive. I think the attitude of the UK government on global trade is a pretty positive one. I think they're trying to conduct as many free trade agreements with third parties in the next couple of years as possible. I think that's a good sign. And they're also talking about domestic reform, domestic regulatory reform. So I can imagine some positive signs there. But overall, leaving the single biggest free trade area, this will have a rather negative effect. How much they're going to be able to balance that with other free trade agreements, I think it will be difficult, but nevertheless, they will have to try.
Yeah, what is the situation now relating to the border issue between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland?
Ooh, that's the trickiest question anyone could ask, probably. And I honestly wouldn't pretend to understand the whole situation there. I think that it's a mix of political, economic, sociological, even security concerns that people have at the border. An incredibly tricky situation, obviously, because of the history. I think the EU made a massive mistake with the introduction or possible introduction of Article 16 for a moment. I think they retracted on that very, very quickly. It's a very touchy issue, both for the UK government and the EU itself. So obviously, I think Brexit has a massive impact on it that will not be resolved in the next couple of years. What's the long-term future of Northern Ireland? I think it's equally difficult to predict, to be fair. There are some voices that would like to join the Republic of Ireland. There are some very strict and stringent voices that are incredibly pro-union. But I have to say the vast majority of the British public doesn't seem to be that obsessed with Northern Ireland like the political elites. So for an average British citizen, The question of Scottish independence or this question of Northern Ireland doesn't play a massive role. So political elites are trying to use these issues to further their own agendas, but how much the average citizen of the EU or how much the average citizen of the UK cares, I think it's rather limited.
Okay, let's get out of the United Kingdom now and go somewhere else. There's a new administration in Washington, D.C. What do you expect to see as far as foreign and economic policies are concerned?
Well, I think on the face of it, most people in Europe have been rather relieved. They hope that this new administration will mean a return to normal. Whether return to normal is what we need is another question. I think we should pursue something much better than the return to normal. I think even under the Obama administration, there were some strategic drifts between the EU's foreign policy and the US's foreign policy. That's going to remain the case even with the Biden administration. I think Russia is going to be a big topic of discussion, where the largest EU member state, Germany, to put it mildly, doesn't agree with the US attitudes. I think the Gazprom pipeline issues are going to remain a very tricky debate to have. NATO contributions are going to be equally problematic. I think more and more people in the United States realize that they have been subsidizing the military affairs of Europe for a very, very long time. Trump, in his own way, made some progress because actually people in governments throughout Europe managed to increase their shares of military spending in the last 4 years. Whether that trend is going to continue or whether the Biden administration will be a bit more relaxed in its demands, I think it's up for grabs. On the positive front, I think there's going to be a lot of agreement on climate change. So the US joining or rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement is rather a positive sign from the EU's perspective. It's going to be a lot easier to negotiate with other global players having the US by their side. But a lot of these strategic drifts are going to remain, not just in terms of foreign policy, but economic policy as well. I think a free trade agreement, trying to restart TTIP, will not be an easy task if there is a willingness on either side of the Atlantic to even start doing it. Questions around taxation will remain rather problematic, and there's a lot of discussion in EU circles and OECD circles about the introduction of a tax on American tech giants. So the Trump administration has been rather protective of these American companies. I think that's going to be the case with the Biden administration as well. So I think on the whole, the dialogue and the diplomatic relations are going to look much, much healthier, but some of these strategic discussions and differences will remain.
Okay, talking about strategy and diplomacy, a couple of weeks ago, my guest on the podcast was András Simonyi, the former Hungarian ambassador to Washington, D.C., and he told me that the new administration is going to look differently on Hungary and Eastern Europe. Trump was a good friend of Viktor Orban, and the Biden administration, especially with the new Secretary of State Antony Blinken, is going to change America's policy towards Hungary. Do you anticipate the same thing to happen?
I think that is the hope of many liberals on this side of the Atlantic, but I would be a bit more cautious than Mr. Simonyi on this front, to be fair. I think a lot of the American foreign policy is driven by economic interests and geopolitical strategic goals, which of course makes sense. And if Mr. Orban continues to be a rather unreliable NATO member and an unreliable partner to the US, then I agree. Then I think there will be pressure on Hungary from the United States to conduct some domestic reforms here in Hungary. But if Orban manages to kind of evade these issues rather well, like he has done in the past 10 years, opening up to China and Russia somewhat, but also increasing its military spending for NATO forces, also buying a lot of American helicopters and German tanks, then I think these issues will not be as strong as many are hoping. So I'm rather a firm believer of realpolitik when it comes to these foreign policy, geopolitical issues. And Orban has been rather clever on this front in the last decade. He might be under more pressure under the new Biden administration, at least symbolically. There will be some drifts that we have seen, I think, in 2014, 2015, in the last couple of years of the Obama administration. But overall, as long as Hungary seems to be a semi-reliable member of NATO and a semi-reliable economic partner for the US and German companies, I don't think it's in the American interest to exercise too much pressure on Hungary, which is rather sad from a Hungarian perspective, I have to say. But at the end of the day, it's the goal of Hungarian voters and Hungarian citizens to pressure their government and pressure their political elites for change. And Hungary is going to have elections next year. So I think there is a rather good chance to achieve that.
Well, since you brought up the election, I have to ask you about that. The cooperation between the opposition parties. As far as I know, you've been very enthusiastic about the Momentum movement once it got started, and now you see Momentum and Jobbik and the Socialists and all the parties joining hands and running against the Fidesz candidates. They believe in a new strategy of having one candidate in one constituency against the Fidesz candidate, for which they are preparing with a primary, hopefully sometime in the middle of this year. So how do you see this cooperation of the opposition parties?
It's going to be a tremendously difficult task, but it's basically the only way to go forward. I think the Hungarian opposition and their political leaders have learned from the Polish experience, and they have learned from the municipal elections where they saw that the only reasonable way to have a powerful voice against the government is not to have 6, 7, 8 tiny or small political parties, but a united rainbow coalition. But obviously, these political parties have a very different history and not very different, but diverging worldviews, to put it mildly. Jobbik has been a neo-Nazi party, frankly, for much of its history, and it's going to be part of this coalition. Momentum is rather on the left liberal side of the debate. The socialists have split into 2 political parties. Both are social democratic from a European perspective. So in terms of policy ideas and in terms of party political history, it's a very, very diverse set of political parties. But what unites them is really the strong opposition against the Orban government and the need to return to liberal democratic principles. So I think the theoretical decision to provide a united front against the Orban government is rather a positive one. How these political parties and their political leaders will manage to cooperate during a rather intense election period, basically the next 14 months, that remains to be seen. But I think they have realized that that's pretty much the only way that they even have a chance to win the elections.
Well, you mentioned Jobbik being a little bit odd in this coalition. However, a lot of analysts are saying that the party has changed, actually has swapped places with Fidesz being the neo-Nazi and very radical right, and Jobbik has moved into the center. Do you see it this way as well?
Yeah, I would agree with this overall analysis. I wouldn't call Jobbik a neo-Nazi party today. I think there's a new neo-Nazi party called Our Homeland, which continues to be the extremist voice on Hungarian politics when it comes to far-right politics. So yes, I agree with the analysis that Jobbik has moved much, much more towards the center in the last 5 years, which is rather a good thing. But I think the history of the party makes quite a few people still uncomfortable, even if there are new faces, new slogans, and the like. But we shouldn't forget that Fidesz basically experienced the vast majority of the political spectrum in the last 30 years. So it started out as a liberal political party, then it went more towards a conservative, Christian conservative one, and then it ended up as an alt-right Trumpist movement before Trump even. So it's definitely possible for political parties to change and move on the political spectrum.
There's one thing that worries a lot of people outside of Hungary, and this is the media freedom. The situation of free media in Hungary. Well, just this week, an independent radio station was shut down, and basically all that people may consume, especially in the countryside, is in the hands of the government. What's your view on this?
It's completely obvious that in 2022, Hungary is not going to have a free and fair election. It might be free, but it definitely will not be fair. And part of that problem is how the media landscape looks in the country. The Hungarian government likes to point to market mechanisms when it comes to discussions around media freedom and say that, okay, these are privately owned companies and conglomerates, so they are allowed to be as critical or as pro-government as they like. But obviously, the situation is a lot more delicate than that. The government managed to create privately owned media conglomerates that are linked directly to Fidesz-friendly oligarchs. That is a massive problem because, as you pointed out, they own the vast majority of local newspapers, local radio stations, TV stations, and everything that you can imagine when it comes to traditional media. So that will be impossible to change in the foreseeable future. The opposition will just have to deal with a very, very strong campaign against them through these media conglomerates. The only hope that they have is utilizing internet campaigns as well as possible. There, the picture is a bit more divergent. There are a lot of the opposition-leaning media companies are actually financed through their readers, and the readers seem rather keen to enable their independence. So when the largest opposition online newspaper, for example, has been when Index has been taken away by government oligarchs, and then their readers actually managed to set up a completely new company and finance it through donations, and it seems to be a workable model. So it's not going to change the whole media landscape of Hungary, but I think people have understood that unless they're willing to put some of their money into independent media outlets, then the government is going to take each and every one over. Club radio that you have mentioned is one of these examples, a rather sad one that has been recently taken over, or basically just outlawed through regulations and supposedly independent media regulators. But I think through financing by readers, there's going to be more and more alternate independent media sources that are going to be available online. But of course, that doesn't really solve the problem for those who are only getting their news from local newspapers and local radios without the access to internet.
Exactly, especially in the countryside, where most people read offline. So print newspapers, listen to the state radio, and listen to or watch state television. Now, Adam, one final question: are you planning to get involved in Hungarian politics, or are you gonna stay with the think tank world in London? So that is, are you coming home to Hungary, or are you staying in London in the long run?
I've spent my whole adult life in the United Kingdom, and I think that will continue to remain the case. I'm just in a process of applying to the UK citizenship. So my plan is to continue to be present all over Europe, basically travel a lot once the pandemic is over. Our network of think tank is very much Brussels focused and Brussels based. So my kind of dual life between London and Brussels will hopefully continue to remain the case. I tremendously enjoy being in Hungary and I love Budapest, but at the moment I don't see any possible path for a classical liberal think tanker to do the same kind of stimulating role that I'm doing in London and Brussels at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. Today's podcast was hosted by Zoltán Kész and our guest was Ádám Bartha. Thank you very much and see you next time.
Thanks for having me on.